The story begins where silence grows heavy, beneath the pale shimmer of the Atlantic, where the light moves like memory. Divers call this region the Porcupine Bank, a sunken plateau west of Ireland, mapped first by expedition vessels of the early 20th century. To most, it is only a ridge of silt and stone. But under certain conditions, when the sea is perfectly still, the sunlight glides across its surface like glass, and shadows below arrange themselves into patterns no current could have carved. Long lines, arches, the ghost geometry of a city that once breathed. They say the ocean once held a reflection of towers now erased. Imagine a dawn where the sky and water became indistinguishable, each mirroring the other, each swallowing the image of lost spires. That is where our descent begins, not into darkness, but into the memory of light itself. As we sink, the world becomes slow, filtered through sapphire silence. The water presses close, as if listening. Through the murk emerge fragments of marble avenues still gleaming faintly under drifting light. Coral wraps the columns like vines, weaving its own scripture over the stones. Every archway, every fallen lintel hums with something ancient. Not sound, but vibration, the long echo of intention. Archaeologists who once surveyed the Azores Plateau noted strange terraces 200 meters below, arranged in right angles far too precise for chance. Their instruments recorded the outlines of what seemed to be walls, chambers, corridors. Some dismissed them as geological accidents, basalt fracturing under pressure. Others, quietly, marked them with the word megalithic and left the rest unsaid. Here, in the stillness, the listener drifts through one such avenue. The sea has replaced air, and yet the city breathes through the slow sway of weeds, through the pulse of fish weaving through broken gates. You pass a statue half buried in silt, a figure robed and kneeling, the face serene but the eyes carved with impossible detail, human eyes, gazing toward the east as though waiting for sunrise. Who sculpted such a thing? And what sunrise could reach this deep? In 1968, near Bimini in the Bahamas, divers discovered a line of stone blocks, massive, uniform, stretching across the seafloor like a causeway. It was soon named the Bimini Road. Some claimed it was a natural formation, others an ancient harbor wall. The myths of Atlantis flared anew, briefly lighting up the cold corridors of academia before sinking back under ridicule. Yet the stones remain, unmoved, patterned like the ribs of something once alive. Perhaps the city beneath the Mirror Sea was not Atlantis itself, but one of its echoes, a sanctuary built in its likeness, by those who remembered its laws and feared its fall. Civilizations often leave reflections of themselves scattered across time, like shards of a single, broken mirror. The deeper we go, the quieter the sea becomes. Sand muffles everything. Here, columns stand like organ pipes for forgotten hymns. Schools of pale fish drift through collapsed domes, each movement stirring clouds of memory from the floor. And sometimes, when the light strikes right, the inscriptions on the walls shimmer. Spirals, suns, eyes within eyes. The language is unreadable, but its rhythm is familiar, as though the sea itself whispers syllables between waves. Fragments of volcanic glass have been found on continental shelves near Gibraltar, vitrified by extreme heat, the kind produced when land sinks into molten fault lines. Some believe they are remnants of an ancient catastrophe, a real tectonic drowning that inspired the myth Plato preserved. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE, he spoke of a mighty island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, larger than Libya and Asia combined, that vanished in a single day and night of misfortune. Was he describing memory or geography? No one can say, but when you hover above these ruins, watching sand slip through the fingers of a statue that no longer holds time, you begin to understand why myth survives longer than cities. The magnetic sensors still hummed. Each pulse echoed faintly, then returned hollow, as though striking hidden cavities. Beneath the dunes, something resonated. When the first descent began, the water was tinted bronze by suspended dust. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The diver adjusted his light and saw, through the murk, a curve of metal protruding from the seafloor. Smooth, round, and ringing softly when touched. A bell. It was fused to the sand as if grown from it, its surface coated in fine carbonate crust. Around it lay fragments of similar shape, half-buried, forming a pattern that spread outward in widening circles. Dozens of them, maybe more. As the team cleared silt, they realized the bells were aligned along ridges resembling ancient harbor walls. Each ridge was segmented by pillars of corroded bronze, their tops flattened, anchor points for something that once moved with the tide. Dr. Alara de Souza's voice came through the comm line, soft and reverent. Acoustic architecture, possibly ceremonial. Record every frequency. The diver tapped one of the bells again. The sound rolled through the water, low and mournful, like a sigh pressed through centuries. Another diver struck a second bell, smaller, higher pitched. The two tones intertwined, harmonic, precise. Later analysis showed that the frequencies corresponded to 432 Hz and 528 Hz, tones historically linked to Pythagorean tuning, known for their resonance with biological harmonics. Yet these bells predated human metallurgy by thousands of years. The metallurgical scans from the Orphean's onboard lab showed traces of tin, copper, and an alloy unknown to modern classification, perhaps stabilized by rare manganese deposits found only along the mid-Atlantic ridge. The current moves like thought. A mosaic floor reveals itself, tesserae of obsidian and pearl still intact, forming the shape of a spiral galaxy, as if the builders knew that their story was not just of Earth, but of the cosmos. Each fragment glows faintly, reflecting a light that doesn't come from the sun. Some divers claim the glow intensifies as they approach, though instruments record nothing unusual. It was as if an ancient civilization had cast the ocean itself into sound. Somewhere above, a storm rolled across the surface, distant thunder vibrating faintly through the hull. The diver thought of the ancient mariners who might have once listened for these tones. Bells meant not to call the living, but to awaken memory. A passage between dunes opened ahead, framed by coral-encrusted pillars. The sand fell away, revealing a shallow amphitheater. At its center stood the largest bell yet, over 6 meters tall, shaped like an inverted dome, inscribed with spirals and sigils similar to those from the shattered compass. Beneath its rim, faint carvings read, "For the dawn that never came." The diver swam closer. He placed his hand on the bell. The vibration was subtle but constant, not produced by motion, but by the ocean's own current. The bell was singing. Hydrophones captured the sound and relayed it to the surface. The crew listened through their headsets in stunned silence. The tone fluctuated with the rhythm of the waves above, forming patterns too complex for coincidence. One technician whispered, "It's coded." In her log, de Souza later wrote, "The bells appear to form a harmonic field. Each frequency responds to another in mathematical proportion. If reconstructed, it could represent a celestial alignment, possibly a record of tides and eclipses." At dusk, as the team surfaced, lightning flickered along the horizon. The sea roared, and for a moment, they could hear the bells faintly even from the deck, muffled, metallic, yet unmistakable. It is said that in 1948, Jacques Cousteau's team filmed structures off the coast of Cadiz resembling temple platforms. The footage, later lost, reportedly showed steps carved into bedrock. Cousteau himself dismissed it publicly, perhaps to protect the sanctity of the find, perhaps because the world was not ready to listen. The following morning, when the divers returned, the dunes had shifted. The amphitheater was gone. The sand had closed over it, sealing everything. The sonar, once filled with echoes, now returned silence. De Souza stared at the readings for a long time. Then she closed her notebook and said quietly, "Perhaps the bells only ring when the ocean remembers." And beneath them, far below the waves, something still hummed. A choir of bronze asleep in the sand, waiting for the next storm to wake it. The storm had passed, but the sea remained restless. Waves shimmered under a thin dawn, each crest breaking with the faint metallic echo of unseen depths. The Orphean II drifted silently above a sector the charts marked as void. No islands, no trenches, no name. And yet, as the sonar swept eastward, A shape emerged on the screen. A perfect spiral etched across the seabed, nearly 2 kilometers wide. It was no coral formation. It was too deliberate, too symmetrical. Dr. Ilara de Souza leaned over the monitor. "It's a map," she whispered. At first, the others thought she was being poetic. But as the submersible Icarus descended, its lights revealed lines carved into the rock, ridges and valleys arranged like coastlines, outlines of landmasses not matching any known on Earth. There was a suggestion of continents, not as they are, but as they might have been. The diver hovered above it, his torch brushing the seafloor. The lines shimmered faintly, dusted with manganese oxide, preserved beneath millennia of sediment. At the spiral's center stood a disk of obsidian, polished smooth, marked with intersecting circles and faint magnetic scoring. When his gloved hand brushed the surface, the compass clipped to his wrist trembled, then pointed not north, but toward the disk itself. The scene drifts onward. The water grows colder. Statues emerge, each more eroded than the last. Faces blurred into anonymity, hands clasped mid-prayer. You feel as though you are intruding upon a ritual still ongoing. The sediment rises like incense, wrapping the ruins in silver haze. Somewhere, a whale's distant song threads through the deep, a voice that could be grief or remembrance. Above, the Orphean's instruments flickered. The magnetic field spiked, coordinates shifted by several degrees. It was as if the seafloor itself had become a pole. The divers began to map the carvings digitally. The outlines revealed a vision of the planet that no human civilization should have possessed. A world where continents fit together like puzzle pieces, connected by shallow land bridges and symmetrical arcs. Antarctica appeared free of ice. South America extended into a curved peninsula that merged with a lost equatorial shelf. It was unmistakably a representation of Earth before the great floods, before memory fractured. De Souza recalled the Pyrie Reis map, drawn in 1513, which inexplicably depicted the Antarctic coast centuries before its discovery. Historians had dismissed it as coincidence, yet here lay its mirror, carved not in ink, but in stone, 10,000 years older. The diver adjusted his camera. Beneath the spiral were additional markings, symbols resembling astronomical coordinates, but slightly skewed, as if measured from a different axis. They indicated positions of stars long vanished from the polar sky, constellations displaced by precession tens of millennia ago. The deeper they traced the pattern, the more it seemed alive. Sections of the spiral resonated faintly when the submersible sonar passed over them, vibrating at different frequencies. When plotted, those frequencies matched the intervals of planetary orbits, from Mercury to Neptune. It was not only a map of the Earth. It was a map of alignment. Back aboard the Orphean, de Souza's team cross-referenced the sonar data with NOAA's global magnetic charts. A faint correlation appeared. The spiral's orientation mirrored the planet's geomagnetic drift over the past 780,000 years. "What if it's not geography?" she murmured. "What if it's memory? The Earth remembering its own shape? In that resonance lies the truth all archaeologists know but seldom speak. Every discovery is also a burial. To uncover is to disturb. To name is to steal from silence. And so the city remains half-hidden, protected by its own forgetting." The next descent was made at twilight. The sea was glass-like, the sky pale and exhausted. The diver reached the center again and noticed a narrow fissure in the obsidian disk. From it emanated a thin current, cool but rhythmic, as though the seafloor exhaled. He aimed a light into the fissure. Beneath lay an empty chamber, perfectly circular. On its inner walls, faint etchings glowed, coastlines shifting, rising, submerging. The diver watched as one continent slid beneath another, and another rose in its place. It was as though the map were breathing through time. He recorded everything, though no one aboard the Orphean could later explain the phenomenon. The recordings showed only darkness and static. When the diver surfaced, the sky had deepened into amber. De Souza stood at the rail, notebook in hand, her expression unreadable. "We draw maps," she said softly, "to remember where we have been, but perhaps the world draws them too, to remember what it has lost. That night, the sea fell utterly still. The coordinates vanished from sonar, replaced by blank signal. The spiral had disappeared. But when they checked the magnetometer the next morning, they found something impossible. The reading from the previous night had been traced. Not in their data, but in the sediment near the ship's hull. An exact replica of the spiral pressed in silt. As if the map had surfaced just for a moment to remind them that the Earth too dreams. Night had settled over the Atlantic. The Orphean II drifted through a calm sea, its hull murmuring softly under the pull of the tide. After the map, the instruments had fallen quiet. No anomalies, no pulses, only the slow rhythm of the water. But at midnight, a faint luminescence appeared below, a bloom of color rising from the deep like breath from the sleeping earth. Perhaps it was once a port of philosophers, or a colony of exiles who fled the great flood to preserve fragments of their art. Perhaps it was merely an illusion, a trick of light, a projection of our longing to find meaning in the deep. Yet still, the symmetry of the stones, the alignment of columns toward celestial north, the patterns of spiral carvings matching ancient Cycladic symbols, all hint at a civilization that understood both mathematics and the divine. The crew at first mistook it for plankton, but the pattern was too deliberate. The glow pulsed in perfect intervals, forming a vast circle nearly half a kilometer wide. The submersible Icarus was deployed once more. As it descended, the water turned pale green, then silver, then colorless, the world narrowing into light. The cameras caught the source, a valley of crystalline trees, their branches translucent and gently swaying. From each hung oval forms, smooth and hollow, shaped like fruit made of glass. The divers floated among them, lights dimmed, unwilling to disturb the quiet radiance. The orchard shimmered, every branch alive with refracted glow. When the current passed, the fruits chimed faintly, their thin shells vibrating in harmony. Dr. Ilara D'Souza spoke over the calm. Note coordinates, possible hydrothermal origin, silicate crystallization from superheated vents. But her voice, though clinical, trembled slightly. The scene felt too arranged, too symmetrical, as though nature had borrowed the geometry of intention. Each tree was rooted in a mound of mineralized coral. Scans showed a high concentration of silica and calcium carbonate, interlaced with traces of manganese and lithium, elements that respond to magnetic charge. It was as if the entire orchard were alive with stored light. The diver reached for one of the fruits. It was warm to the touch. When his glove brushed it, a ripple of luminescence spread through the branch, cascading into the others. Every orb responded, a wave of light passing through the forest like the breath of dawn. The hydrophones caught something then, a faint resonance too low for human hearing, repeating every 13 seconds. The frequency matched one recorded previously at the Compass Temple. Same origin, whispered D'Souza. Different expression. As we rise toward the surface, light returns, fractured by the rippling skin of the sea. The ruins blur, dissolve, and then vanish altogether, as if erasing themselves from memory once more. Only the faint reflection remains. Towers that are not there, walls that are only suggestion. Closer examination revealed micro-etchings on the surface of each fruit. Spiral inscriptions, too small for the naked eye. Under magnification, they appeared as waveforms, patterns identical to the resonance data from the bells beneath the sand. It was sound turned to crystal. The orchard was not growing. It was remembering. D'Souza's log would later describe it as a photonic archive, a structure formed by interaction between volcanic glass and resonant frequency, a natural recorder sculpted by vibration. But standing within that glowing valley, such explanations felt like candlelight before a storm. At the far edge of the orchard stood a single tree larger than the rest, its roots fused into black basalt. Its fruits were darker, filled with swirling luminescence. The diver approached and saw that inside one orb floated a faint silhouette, a shape like a human face, or perhaps just the play of refracted light. He lifted the orb gently. It hummed. For a brief instant, it projected a faint pattern onto the water. Outlines of a city, towers under waves, light spilling through arches. Then the glow faded, and the orb grew still again. "Recording completed," said the comm officer softly, though none spoke afterward. Back on the Orpheon 2, the samples were sealed in pressure chambers. Under microscope, their inner lattices showed impossible complexity. Patterns echoing DNA helices, though built of silicate instead of carbon. "We're looking at data storage," said D'Souza finally. "Not metaphor, literal." The ocean wrote in glass. That night, the crew drifted above the coordinates, listening to the faint chime rising through the hull. Some said it sounded like wine through leaves. Others said it was the sound of thought itself. The ocean closes above them, calm and impenetrable. Waves mirror the sky perfectly again, sealing the gate. When morning came, the glow below was gone. The sonar showed nothing but smooth basalt plain. Yet in the lab, one of the sealed samples began to pulse faintly. A slow rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. Perhaps it was never glass at all. Perhaps it was memory, blooming again. The ocean was silver that night. A full moon hung low over the horizon, trembling on the surface like a lantern in the breath of the tide. The Orpheon 2 drifted silently, its instruments dimmed, its crew hushed. The glow of the previous discovery, the orchard, had faded days ago, yet something lingered in the currents, a rhythm that refused to disappear. The magnetic readings showed a faint pulse eastward, a pattern that repeated every lunar cycle. Dr. Hilaire D'Souza traced the curve on the chart, a path that led toward an unexplored region near the ancient Madeira abyssal plain. It seemed almost deliberate, as though the ocean itself were pointing. They followed. The descent began under a pale blue moon. The sea shimmered with particulate light, tiny bioluminescent threads weaving through the black. The diver adjusted his instruments, watching the readings dance between silence and interference. Then, through the drifting haze, he saw them. Pillars rising from the sand, tall as spires, each one crowned by a reflective stone. At first they seemed random, but viewed from above, their arrangement formed a pattern, a curve echoing the phases of the moon. 12 stones for 12 nights, set along a spiral descending into darkness. It was an observatory drowned in time, and you, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, are left with a single thought. Perhaps the sea remembers everything, even what the sun forgot. Each pillar was carved with circular grooves, their edges smoothed by millennia of current. When the diver shone his light across them, the symbols flickered: crescents, disks, waves, images of the moon in every stage of its vanishing. Back on the Orpheon, D'Souza compared the coordinates with ancient terrestrial alignments. The spacing matched that of the Karnak stones in France, yet the angle of orientation pointed not to the sunrise, but to the lunar nodes, the places where eclipses are born. "These were lunar pilgrims," she whispered, "people who measured the rhythm of disappearance." Further analysis revealed that the pillars were composed of polished basalt coated with a thin layer of silver nitrate, the same compound used in early photography. The moonlight refracted faintly along their surfaces even here, more than a kilometer beneath the waves. The diver moved deeper into the spiral's heart. There he found an open circle, its floor paved with concentric rings of white coral. In the center stood a broken statue, a figure cloaked in stone, its hands cupped as if holding something once radiant. Fragments around the statue hinted at what it might have held. A sphere, perhaps of quartz, shattered long ago. The diver felt a tremor through the current, a soft vibration, like a voice rising through the water. The hydrophones aboard the ship captured it too, a low chant-like hum, modulated by the tide. The frequency repeated every 27.3 days, the lunar orbit. It was not sound, it was calendar. In her log, D'Souza wrote, "Every age has its astronomers. Some built towers, others built tides. For beneath every ripple lies an echo of something sacred, a memory of stone, of breath, of those who built beauty knowing it would one day sink. Some voices do not vanish. They simply choose a slower language, one spoken in currents, in choral, in the hush beneath time." The divers documented each pillar, noting how light from their lamps refracted along their edges. connecting the stones with invisible lines. When mapped digitally, those lines formed an ancient route, a maritime path that once connected these coordinates to sites along the African and Mediterranean coasts. Perhaps, she thought, this was where the first navigators learned the ocean's clock, following not stars, but the moon's reflection. At twilight, when they surfaced, the horizon gleamed silver. The moon hung lower now, close to the waterline, its edge touching the sea. D'Souza watched in silence. When they followed the moon down, she murmured. Perhaps they believed it led to another shore. No one answered. The ocean was vast, the night still. Beneath them, the pillars gleamed faintly in the reflected light, as if the moon itself were whispering back. And somewhere, deep within the silence, the pilgrims still walked, their path repeating with every tide, following the moon down into eternity. By the time the Orphean II reached the coordinates, the ocean had turned dark as graphite. The moon was gone. Only the soft green of the depth gauges glowed within the cabin. The sea here was deeper than any they had entered before, 4,300 meters, a region known on old Portuguese charts as Mar dos Colossos. Mariners once claimed that the currents changed direction without wind, as though something vast stirred below. The sonar returned irregular shadows, towering shapes that rose from the seafloor like the broken ribs of a mountain. Each echo came back delayed, diffused, as if the sound itself hesitated to return. Dr. Hilaria D'Souza studied the scans. Basalt columns, she said softly, but too uniform, too tall. Listen closely, and you may still hear it. The city beneath the mirror sea, still dreaming beneath the weight of silence, waiting for a listener who will not disturb its rest. At 23:40 hours, the Icarus descended. The water was black, thick as ink. The pressure hummed against the hull. At 3,900 meters, the first of the giants appeared. A vertical monolith of fused basalt and manganese, 40 meters high, shaped roughly like a human form. Shoulders, torso, crown. Erosion had smoothed the surface, but the symmetry remained undeniable. Around it, dozens more, some toppled, others leaning as if in frozen procession. Their arrangement followed no grid, yet their spacing resonated in harmonic proportion, the same ratio used in the bells beneath the sand. The diver moved slowly between them. His light grazed the stone faces, if they were faces, revealing cavities where eyes might have been. Inside those hollows, pale crustaceans clung like remnants of thought. The seabed below was paved with slabs, fractured but deliberate, their edges beveled. Silt drifted through cracks like dust in cathedral light. When the diver's lamp passed over one seam, the magnetic sensors spiked. Reading flux, said D'Souza. There's metal in the foundation. Moments later, the hydrophones caught a low, percussive rhythm. One note, repeated at immense distance. It was not mechanical. It was seismic, measured, like the echo of an ancient heart. Could be vent activity, said the technician, but the sound carried pattern. 3 pulses, pause, 2 pulses, then silence. The diver descended into a corridor between the monoliths. Walls of stone loomed on either side. Bioluminescent plankton drifted in vertical streams, mimicking candlelight. The pressure made every movement slow, reverent. He aimed his camera upward. The columns converged into arches, an immense vault. The entire structure resembled a cathedral carved by the tectonic hand of the planet. Yet between the joints of the basalt, thin seams of alloy glimmered, as though the rock had been reinforced by intelligence. Within the central chamber, he found a floor of white calcite streaked with darker veins. Embedded in it were colossal shapes, bones. The sea had gone still. Not fossilized fish, nor whales. Vertebrae wider than doors, ribs like fallen bridges.
Megafauna? Whispered D'Souza.
No known species matches, replied the biologist. Density too high, structure unknown. The diver traced one rib. Its texture was metallic, magnetized. He placed his gloved hand upon it. The hydrophone tone deepened. Across the ship's instruments, every dial drifted, every clock slowed by seconds. D'Souza whispered, "Time distortion," but it was only perception or perhaps awe itself slowing thought. The team later determined that piezo-magnetic stress along the ridge could have produced the temporal illusion. Yet none could deny the sensation that the place watched them. In her notebook, D'Souza wrote, "The cathedral is older than motion. Its pillars are not built but revealed, the skeleton of the planet mistaken for gods." The diver advanced to the deepest recess. There, an aperture opened into a cavern glowing faintly blue. Inside, a single figure lay on its side, half buried. A titan, humanoid, sculpted from fused basalt, its chest hollow, its heart cavity filled with slow-moving luminescent algae. Only the bubbles rising from the diver's suit marked the passage of breath. He floated upward through blue haze, leaving behind the marble ruins of the Mirror Sea. But even as he rose, something tugged at him. His compass had stopped. As the current passed, the algae pulsed, casting shadows that rose and fell across the walls, as if the giant breathed. For several minutes no one spoke. The sound of their own oxygen mixed with the low vibration of the sea. Then D'Souza whispered, almost in prayer, "They built their gods as mirrors. When the water rose, the mirrors sank." The diver lingered near the figure's face. Smooth, serene, eroded into peace. A single tear-shaped crack ran down its cheek. He touched it lightly. The vibration ceased. The lights flickered. Then silence. When the Icarus surfaced hours later, dawn had not come. The horizon was black glass. The crew checked the recordings. Everything after that final touch was static. But when they cleaned the camera lens, they found a thin film of crystalline residue. Salt and iron fused together. Under microscope, the particles arranged themselves in a spiral identical to the magnetic pattern recorded at the compass temple. At first, he thought it was broken, the needle spinning without direction. But when he reached the surface, the sun overhead wavered in a way that made him unsure where east truly lay. The Atlantic seemed endless, unmoving. His instruments whispered confusion. Perhaps the giants were not sleeping at all. Perhaps they were listening. After the cathedral, the sea grew quieter. Even the instruments aboard the Orpheon II seemed reluctant to speak. The hydrophones picked up only the long, slow pulse of distant currents, as if the ocean itself had fallen asleep. Dr. Alara D'Souza sat in the darkened control room, studying the faint magnetic deviations still visible on the chart. They formed a pattern that curved west, looping around the mid-Atlantic ridge before fading into uncertainty. She traced the arc with her finger. "Another alignment," she whispered. "Another memory." They followed it. The journey took them into colder water. Temperature dropped by 2 degrees. The light from the surface could no longer reach them. Only the faint blue of the instruments remained. Then, after 13 hours of drifting, the sonar found a circle, a plateau surrounded by symmetrical ridges, its center perfectly flat. At 2:10 Universal Time Coordinated, the Icarus descended. The first thing the diver saw was dust, fine volcanic sediment swirling like smoke. Beneath it, he glimpsed structures half buried. Pedestals, collapsed columns, fragments of crystalline glass. Then, as the silt cleared, he realized they were lenses, enormous discs of polished quartz, arranged in a spiral, each tilted at a different angle. A field of mirrors all aimed upward. Later, when the research vessel Orpheon II recorded the data, the scientists would note the anomaly. Magnetic deviation near 37 degrees north, 28 degrees west, along the mid-Atlantic ridge between the Azores and Madeira. The same coordinates where Noah's bathymetric maps once revealed an underwater plateau shaped like a crescent. The same region where Portuguese logbooks from the 15th century spoke of isles that move beneath the stars. He moved carefully among them, his light glancing across their surfaces. Each lens reflected faint traces of the moon's residual light, filtered through miles of water, yet somehow alive, trembling slightly, as though still following the heavens above. "Record orientation," said D'Souza. "Angle ratios." The data streamed upward to the Orpheon systems. The readings matched star positions from 12,800 years ago, the end of the Younger Dryas, when the skies changed and coastlines drowned. These were astronomers, D'Souza murmured. They mapped not the land, but the sky before it fell. The diver noticed inscriptions etched along the rims of the lenses, spirals within circles, constellations depicted in mirrored symmetry. One lens bore 7 dots arranged in a line, the Pleiades. Another showed a pattern identical to Orion, but inverted, as if seen from beneath the sea. He thought of ancient myths, of stars that drowned, of gods who fell from the sky. Perhaps those stories had begun here. Farther in, the spiral narrowed. The final lens was larger than the rest, its surface fractured, its core filled with sediment. The diver brushed it clean. Beneath the silt, symbols emerged, markings unlike any before. Triangular, crystalline, vibrating faintly when touched. The magnetic sensors reacted instantly. The reading spiked, then stabilized into rhythm. On the Orpheon, the oscillograph displayed a waveform pulsing in regular intervals, a signal almost melodic. "It's transmitting," said the technician, astonished. The diver floated, weightless, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. Below him, the sea shimmered, and within that shimmer, he saw something vast and geometrical, glinting like obsidian. "Not transmitting," corrected D'Souza. "Remembering." The frequency corresponded to 8.72 Hz, the same electromagnetic resonance as the human alpha brainwave. The implication was unsettling. These structures had been tuned to consciousness itself. The diver placed his hand over the cracked lens. For a moment, the world blurred. Through the shimmer, he saw light, stars circling, constellations shifting, the horizon of another world rising from beneath the sea. He heard a soft whisper, not a voice, but the hum of countless equations aligning, like the sound of an ancient mind thinking. Then it vanished. When he surfaced, his first words were, "They watched the sky drown." Later, when the crew analyzed the imagery, they discovered that the orientation of the spiral lenses traced the precession of Earth's axis. Each disk marked a different epoch, as though generations had added to the structure over millennia. D'Souza stood on deck at dawn, the horizon pale and silent. The sea was calm, but something shimmered beneath it, a reflection that didn't belong to the present sky. In her final log entry for that night, she wrote, "They built their observatories where the heavens could not reach them, so the stars might remember instead." As the Orpheon II drifted onward, the magnetic trace behind them faded. The coordinates dissolved. But sometimes, even through the static, a faint echo returned. A slow, rhythmic pulse, repeating across the deep. A ruin. Perhaps the astronomers had never left. Perhaps they were still watching from below. The ocean beyond the last coordinates was darker than memory. Even the stars above the Orpheon II seemed reluctant to reflect upon it. The crew called this region the Black Horizon, a stretch of abyss so deep that sonar dissolved into static and light could not find itself again. They drifted there in silence. No readings, no sound, only the slow hum of the ship's generators and the faint pulse of blood in their ears. Then, just before dawn, the hydrophones began to sing. At first it was a single tone, low and distant, like the breath of a giant turning beneath the sea. Then another joined it, and another, until the spectrum filled with layered harmonics, weaving a chord too deep to be human. The Orpheon II trembled. The sound was not coming from above or below. It was everywhere. The crew recorded the frequencies. 18 Hz, 36 Hz, 72 Hz, perfect octaves. The same intervals found in cathedral acoustics. Dr. Hilaire D'Souza leaned toward the console. "Source." The technician shook his head. "All directions, Doctor. It's like the ocean itself is resonating." They released the Icarus one final time. The temple of the shattered compass, though he did not know its name yet. The submersible descended into a darkness so absolute that even the instruments hesitated. At 5,200 meters, the first vibration became visible, not as sound, but as motion. Grains of sediment rose and fell rhythmically, forming patterns like ripples on glass. The diver switched on his lights. Beneath him stretched a plain of basalt pillars, each hollow, each open at the top. Inside them, light shimmered faintly, bioluminescent organisms drifting in spirals, echoing the rhythm of the sound. The pillars were arranged in concentric circles, each tuned to a specific depth, like the pipes of an enormous organ. "The architecture is acoustic," whispered D'Souza over the calm, "a harmonic field." When the diver passed over the central ring, his gauges flickered. The pressure oscillated by fractions of an atmosphere, pulsing with the rhythm of the tones. He lowered a probe into one of the openings. The vibrations translated into measurable frequencies. Each pillar sang a note. Together, they formed chords that changed with the current. Cathedral of sound. The team realized that the resonance corresponded to the shape of the seabed. The pillars amplified natural pressure waves traveling through the Atlantic's Sofar Channel, the same layer where whale song can circle the globe. But this was older, intentional. The diver moved toward the center. There, a depression in the seafloor revealed a vast circular stone, carved with spirals and arcs. In its middle lay a cavity filled with shimmering particulate light, iron, silica, manganese, all vibrating in unison. When he descended again, guided only by faint sonar, the ocean deepened into violet shadow. The light narrowed, concentrating into a single shaft that revealed what lay beneath. A complex of radial corridors, spiraling outward from a central dome. The pattern resembled an ancient compass, except its axes were fractured, displaced, as if the structure itself had been torn by the forces it once tried to measure. The sound deepened. The diver's suit sensors began to record faint electrical activity synchronized with his own heartbeat. For a moment, it was impossible to tell whether the pulse came from him or from the sea. D'Souza's voice came softly. "Everything that ever lived leaves a vibration. What if this place remembers all of them?" He knelt before the stone. The vibrations intensified. Through the water, the pillars began to hum together, a choir of ancient architecture. Each note carried echoes of others. The bells, the compass, the map, the orchard, the giants. Every discovery resonated here, woven into one immense soundscape. It was not a ruin. It was a symphony. As the frequencies rose, the diver saw particles of light swirling above the plane, arranging themselves into faint geometric shapes, the same constellations once etched on the astronomer's lenses. Then, as quickly as it began, the tone shifted. The harmonics collapsed into a single sustained note, low, deep, infinite. The Orphean too shuddered. Monitors went dark. For 43 seconds, the entire ocean seemed to hold its breath. Then came silence. Historians aboard the Orphean compared its geometry to Ptolemaic cosmograms, circles within circles, symbolizing the motion of celestial spheres. Yet this temple was older than such systems. The basalt slabs were flecked with manganese nodules, dated through spectral analysis to at least 12,000 years before present, the boundary of the Younger Dryas, when coastlines shifted and myths of floods began. When power returned, the sonar showed nothing. The pillars were gone. Only the abyss remained. But the recording equipment had captured the last resonance. A sequence of frequencies identical to human speech rhythm, yet beyond language, an oceanic prayer. In her final log of the night, D'Souza wrote, "We did not find Atlantis. We found its echo." As dawn rose over the Atlantic, the crew stood on deck, listening to the hum within their bones. Perhaps the ocean had been singing all along. Perhaps we had simply learned, at last, to listen. The sea did not sing that morning. After the choir fell silent, the Orphean too drifted east in a hush so complete that even the gulls avoided the wake. A gray sky pressed low upon the horizon, and the ocean wore the color of unlit steel. In the control room, the instruments showed only a thin, wavering line. Current, faint and constant, flowing shoreward, as if some distant memory had begun to breathe. Dr. Ilara D'Souza traced it with a finger. "Tidal draw," she said softly. "A long one." She marked the coordinates on the chart, the way an old monk might illuminate a margin. Careful, reverent, aware that the page remembered more than the ink. They followed the pull. Inside the structure, The diver found walls engraved with spirals that converged toward a broken disc. Some carvings showed human figures holding rods aligned with stars, others kneeling before magnetic stones set in circular frames. The stones still emitted faint energy. The diver's instruments quivered when brought near. In the afternoon, the water lightened, green beneath gray, and the hydrophones caught a shallow cadence. Not song, not thunder, footsteps, if footsteps could be water. The diver prepared without speaking. He had learned that the sea disliked questions. The submersible Icarus slipped beneath the surface and fell through a column of pale light that narrowed, then gave way to dusk. Silt rose like pollen. The temperature dropped. The current grew orderly, threading the dark like a loom. At 380 meters, the first shapes appeared. Low walls of stone, running parallel to the seabed, then turning, then braiding, making pens and corridors out of tide. Fish moved through the channels like flocks, a lattice of weirs, ancient and exact. Intertidal architecture. D'Souza breathed over the calm fish traps. We have them on coasts from Wales to Brittany, Doggerland to the Miho. But these are deeper, older. The diver's light found stakes swallowed by calcite, aligned to a vanished shore. Beyond the weirs lay middens, pale mounds dimly luminous under the lamp, shells layered like pages. He brushed his glove over the nearest and a fan of microfauna lifted. Tiny spirals, threads of broken nacre, the powdered dust of long meals shared in the hush between tides. "Alara," the biologist whispered. "Look at the ridge behind the beds." The camera swung. There, curved into the seabed as if sleeping, lay footprints. Pairs and clusters and thin, hurried scatterings, pressed into once wet clay that had hardened, drowned, and memorized. Some small as a child's, some long as a hunter's stride. The diver placed the scale bar gently. The clay did not crumble. "OSL dating sites," D'Souza said, voice steady by force. "Sediment once exposed to sunlight, then sealed. We can read the last light it saw." He followed the line of tracks toward a slope where low stones rose from the clay. A hearth encircled by pebbles, its ash preserved as darker stain. A ring of post holes in two crescents, like moons nested. On one stone, a carved spiral the size of a palm. On another, a notch repeated 13 times. "Lunar count," D'Souza said. "Children learning the sea's calendar." Farther on, the ground opened into terraces faced with split slate. The walls were chest-high, their joints chocked with thinner flags. Inside one terrace lay a scatter of bone, fish, seal, auk, and a narrow blade of obsidian no larger than a finger. Obsidian this far in the Atlantic meant trade, or pilgrimage, or the long patience of walking coasts until coasts became a circle. In one chamber, half collapsed, lay the shattered compass itself. Not a device of brass or glass, but a disk of crystal, fractured into 8 glowing fragments. Each fragment pulsed faintly when light passed through it, refracting color like stained glass in deep water. The fragments seemed arranged deliberately, yet imperfectly, as though rebuilt by trembling hands after a catastrophe. He turned the blade beneath the light. Conchoidal rings glimmered like frozen ripples. A sliver of woven fiber clung to the tang, mineralized into a ghost of cordage. The diver held it as one holds a name. To starboard, the ridge steepened, and a wind the sea had forgotten to carry sighed along the slope. The hydrophones picked a new sound, soft repetition, not harmonic like the choir but intimate. A hush that rose and fell in the pattern of tide. It led them to a hollow beneath a roof of stone, the entrance framed by 2 uprights and a lintel. A house or a prayer. Inside the chamber, the silt lay thin. The lamp moved across a floor packed hard and ribbed with footfall. In one corner, a crescent of shells piled neatly, sorted by size, blues and creams nested like cupped hands. In another, a table of flat slate bearing small figurines shaped from whale bone and antler. Seals with inlaid eyes, a bird whose wings were lines, a human figure with arms like oars. Each figure was scored with pairs of marks, 222. As if to say, we came together, we crossed together. On the rear wall, someone had pressed palms into wet clay and left them. Prints of adults and children, big hands and small, a ledger of touch. Over the palm marks, a spiral unfurled, then a second spiral winding the first, then a third. The diver traced the outer curve with light and saw that the spiral was not perfect. It wavered, hesitated, corrected, as though the maker had listened to the ocean and changed the line midstroke. "Put the ROV on station," D'Souza said. "Minimal thrust." The Icarus steadied, lights lowered to candle. In that dimness the prince gathered warmth. The shells remembered rivers. The blade remembered distant glass. The chamber breathed. "We think of cities," D'Souza whispered. "But the first academies were coves, and the first libraries were middens. You can read a century in a shell heap. You can read a childhood in a path." Outside, the diver followed a long trench where poles had once stood in close procession. Their shadows lay parallel, pointing east. Beyond them, the seabed fell away into a tongue of sand that had advanced like a slow animal, swallowing field after field. He could see the last wall it reached. Sand lipped the top and paused there as if listening. A child's heel mark rested on the wall's capstone. He thought of the storm seasons. He thought of the night the tide came higher than it ever had and did not go out quite all the way, and then the next night and the next. He thought of parents measuring a child against a post, not in height but in distance from the door to the waterline. He thought of the moment when the weirs sounded different, their lattice struck by deeper waves, the bass note of a shore unmaking its agreement with time. Near the edge of the shelf, a canoe lay capsized under silt. Ribs of willow, skins long gone, pitch hardened into black seams. A paddle rested beside it, the blade worn at one edge as if habitually corrected against current. The diver lifted it, felt its balance, and set it down again with care reserved for teeth and names. The hydrophones registered a faint tremor. Not quake, not vent, footstep again, but broader like a procession. Across the shelf, schools of fish parted and rejoined as if in rehearsal. The pressure meter quivered. The current reversed. It was there that the diver's audio recorder captured something. A low resonance, rhythmic but untraceable, almost like breathing. Later, spectrogram analysis would reveal the tone to be precisely aligned with the Schumann resonance, the frequency of the Earth's electromagnetic hum. "Tide turning," the text said. "We have minutes." The diver made for the chamber one last time. He placed the scale beside the palm prints, photographed each fingertip's whirl. At the door he looked back. The slate table had shifted almost imperceptibly, an angle truer than before, as if the room remembered how to align itself with the moon. On ascent, the light changed quickly, gray to silver to white. The Orphean II rolled in a long swell. Above the rail, the sky brightened as if someone had polished it. The crew gathered in their damp coats while the screens bloomed with images. Weirs, shells, hands, the blade that found its edge in distant fire. D'Souza closed her notebook. "We have always been children of the tides," she said, "not to the room but to the sea. We learned our first mathematics from the moon. We learned our first music from the weir." She did not add what the diver already knew, that the first exodus was not from land to land but from yesterday's shoreline to today's, that our earliest migration routes were chalked in kelp and foam, that we are older in water than any nation has a word for. That evening the ocean settled into the long breath between flood and ebb. The Orphean II drifted unmoving though it moved. A patch of brightness widened to the west, then faded without sunset, as if the sky had forgotten whether it was day or night. In the lab, the obsidian measured thinner than expected, its hydration rind whispering distance to a volcano the charts called impossible. The shells told a sequence of winters that grew a fraction shorter and summers that grew a fraction long. The OSL samples slept under paper hoods, holding the last light they had known for 10,000 years. Before midnight, the diver returned alone to the stern. The sea lamp threw a pale coin onto the swash. He imagined a small footprint filling with water, then emptying, then filling, the pulse of a life too gentle to endure stone. He imagined a voice at dusk calling from a door. Not name, but pattern, 2 notes, then a pause, then 2. The music by which a child learns to come home. Perhaps it was never the city they sought. Perhaps it was the children. their calendars and bones and days, whose memory the ocean kept most carefully. Not kings, not gods, not beacons, but small hands on clay, counting to 13. He stood until the lamp drew moths from darkness that had never known a wing. Then he went below and closed the log with a single line. Archaeologists whispered theories. Perhaps the temple had been an ancient observatory of fields, magnetic, celestial, spiritual. Perhaps the compass was not meant to guide ships, but consciousness itself. Some voices only echo when we are near enough to wade. The sea, satisfied, turned quietly in its sleep. The first warning came as a change in the taste of the air. Salt grew metallic on the tongue, as if the sky had parted a wire with its teeth. On deck, the crew of the Orphean II watched the western horizon bruise into a deep violet. Sheet lightning fluttered inside the cloud banks like moths searching for a way out. The barometer fell. The sea, which had been as calm as folded silk since morning, gathered itself. Secure labs. Lock the pressure frames, Dr. Alara de Souza said softly, as if speaking louder might tilt the balance. She stood with her notebook pressed to her ribcage and followed the ragged line where sky met water. Storms were not unusual along this latitude. Autumn tempests riding the Azores high, but this felt narrower, deliberate, like a hand drawing breath. The diver checked the Icarus within its cradle. Cables coiled, umbilicals glistened. From the bridge, the XO called wind force rising, Beaufort 8 into 9. Lightning laced the clouds, and a faint corona, St. Elmo's fire, glowed along the bow rail, a blue whisper of charge. Someone muttered a prayer. Someone else switched the hydrophones to a low band and, from the speakers, the sea answered with a static like sand moving through a glass throat. At 1904 Universal Time coordinated, the first downburst struck. Rain fell in bronze chords. The surface broke into a million mouths, each taking and giving breath. In that moment the magnetometer spiked, an abrupt stare of numbers, then a plateau. On the main screen the bathymetry refreshed. A contour rose out of emptiness less than 3 nautical miles ahead. A flat-topped ridge with a crescent bay. Not a ridge streets. De Souza didn't smile. She only touched the glass with one finger, as if the map were a body learning to wake. "She's surfacing," she said, and the room became a chapel. They launched the Icarus into rain hammered flat by wind. The submersible sank through layers bright with plankton, dim with silt, bright again. Lightning forked above. Each flash sketched a skeleton through the water, then left it to memory. At 80 meters the world wore green. At 100, slate. At 132, the light changed in a way that is not light but hush. Stormlight entering the sea. The diver steadied his breathing. The cameras widened their pupils. The city had arranged itself along terraces like steps made for a tide that never forgot its lesson. Long avenues paved with basalt plates ran parallel to a drowned shoreline. Between them, the rain of centuries had planted gardens of coral and limestone, pale as unlit candles. Facades still stood where the current had learned to move around them. Colonnades held their breath. The storm sent a pulse through the upper layers, and down here, the city exhaled. Silt lifting in size, algae dimming, brightening, dimming again. It looked like lungs beneath stone. "CTD at depth," the tech called. The probe fell, tasting salinity, temperature, conductivity, and came back with a story. A sharp picnic line under the storm's footprint, a lens of fresher water pressed downward by rain and wind, carrying charge with it. The diver knew the old sailors' tales of waters lit like lamps when thunder walked. Triboluminescence in fractured crystals, bioluminescence cascading when the sea was struck. Tonight these things had converged, and the city wore their breath. Centuries ago, Portuguese navigator Diogo de Tive wrote of a compass that trembles found in the Azorean fog, whose needle sought not the north but the deep. His writings, archived in Lisbon, were long dismissed as metaphor until now. At the edge of a square lay a long reflecting pool, its borders half buried in sand. Each lightning strike above found it somehow. A sheet of light traveled along the surface like a hand pulling a veil. Under that veil stood statues softened by centuries. A woman with a conch lifted to her ear, a child holding a sphere, a figure without face, only a compass rose for a crown. The diver drifted past and saw that each pedestal bore shallow drill holes lining to the cardinal points, a practical geometry under the poetry, as if the builders had yoked ceremony to survey. He moved down a lane roofed by arches whose keystones had been replaced with glass, now crazed but luminous. St. Elmo's fire ghosted along the edges in threads. The current gathered there, spoke there. In the lee of one wall, a door had fallen inward to reveal a chamber dry in shape if not in fact. Shelves ribbed with mineral accretion, a floor of hexagonal tiles, a table curled with salt. On the table, a plate of hammered copper greened by years and scored with a spiral of tiny cuts. A lightning pulse wandered the room and the copper answered with a breath of light along those cuts, like a map remembering the hand that drew it. Collect? The diver asked because even now consent felt necessary. Photograph. No lift, D'Souza said. Let her keep her organs. The diver obeyed, slow as prayer. Beyond the chamber the street opened toward the bay. There the city showed what storms had made of it. A line of stepped breakwaters radiating outward like ribs, each stone beveled to turn fury into music. The hydrophones recorded the pattern, a scale rising and falling under the gale, not human, not animal, but not the raw howl of weather either. A design turbulence tuned centuries ago and tuning itself still. And as the breaker tops drank lightning, the water leapt in ragged blue flames. Not fire, but breath made visible. To starboard a tower lifted partway from its burial, its top sheared flat by time. The diver circled, and in the lee found stairs spiraling inward. He followed, one hand on the rail where old palms had polished stone. A niche opened at the half-level, and in it a lens waited, quartz within bronze, glass that had seen storms before storms, shot through now with tiny fractures. He touched the rim. The lens shivered. For a heartbeat the tower's throat filled with light, and on the inner wall a procession of images stepped and faded. A market under a canopy of linen, children running between water cellars, a woman counting shells at a door, rain falling so softly you could hear names spoken beneath it. Then nothing, only the wet silence that follows a truth too gentle to keep. When he emerged, the storm had drawn closer. The surface above boiled white. In the city, every edge became a harp string. Langmuir streaks marched across the avenues, and where two crossed the water went glassy, as if the city were scrying. Through that circle the diver saw, impossibly clear, the surface, a black sheet hammered by silver. An instant later the circle clouded, as all circles must. Time, the XO said. Squall line in 5. Recover, recover. He took one last path. A narrow way climbing toward a terrace set with low pillars. Between them lay shallow bowls cut into the floor, arranged in a spiral that tightened, and ended in a hollow no wider than a bowl of bread. He leaned close. The hollow was glazed with something like melted sand, as if it had once held a light hot enough to soften the earth. Lightning walked the roof of the sea. The glaze answered with a faint, milk-blue throb. He did not know if it had been altar, lamp, kitchen, or compass. He knew only that hands had warmed around it. On ascent, the city folded itself, not vanishing but learning a slower breath. The storm, in mercy, loosened its fist. Sheets of rain leaned east. Thunder fell away like carts rolling down a road to someone else's door. The Orphean too lifted the Icarus aboard, and the deck steamed. For a while no one spoke. The diver lingered beside the crystal fragments, feeling the current press gently against his gloves. The shards seemed to hum together, forming a vibration more felt than heard. Each pulse stirred the silt, revealing faint inscriptions underneath. A language of loops and small circles, similar to the mysterious petroglyphs found on Pico Island. D'Souza opened her notebook and wrote without looking. She breathes when storms remind her how, she said, and the sentence felt older than any of them. In the lab, the CTD trace lay beside the magnetometer spikes and the hydrophone's strange, designed surf music. A tech placed a copper plate from the ship stores under a Van de Graaff and traced with a needle. The spiral responded with a hairline filament of light, a toy echo of the city's plate, and even that was enough to turn the room to a hush. Night fell clean. The storm shouldered north. The sea became a single slow muscle. The diver stood alone at the stern and tasted the settled air. The city below would not be there in the morning. He knew this as one knows a tide table by heart. But he had seen the lungs work. He had watched a drowned place draw lightning through water and make it into breath. Perhaps that is all cities are, arrangements where weather learns to speak. And perhaps that is all we are, arrangements ready to listen when it does. He closed the log with a line the ocean would accept. Some lights do not die. They wait for stormlight to remember them. Then the Orphean too turned her bow by a fraction, and the sea, untroubled, inhaled. He shone his light across the central dome. There, the walls curved upward into a ceiling of black glass, obsidian fused with quartz, reflecting not his own face but an inverted sky. Stars moving beneath him, oceans above. Perhaps this was the temple's secret. Not worship, but alignment. The ancients might have believed that the world's magnetic lines were sacred paths, veins of the earth's heart. And when those veins shifted, when the poles trembled, their temples, too, cracked like compasses deprived of truth. Noah's modern instruments still record magnetic drift near the same coordinates. Satellites note an irregular patch where compasses misbehave, and electronic readings falter. To most, it is only a curiosity. To those who remember the myths, it is the heartbeat of something that refused to die. The diver touched one fragment of the crystal. It flickered. For an instant, he saw a reflection. Towers glimmering under waves, faces carved in stone. The city beneath the mirror sea. But this time, the image rotated, aligning perfectly with the fracture lines in the compass. It was as if the ruins were part of a larger design. Cities and temples once connected across oceans by invisible geometry. He withdrew his hand, heart unsteady. When he surfaced again, night had fallen. The ocean was smooth as mercury. The stars above shimmered like instruments recalibrating themselves. His compass still spun slowly, without anchor. Perhaps it was never broken. Perhaps it had merely found something older than direction. And as he drifted in the quiet, he realized the true function of the temple was not to point north, but inward. For those who entered its depths did not return with bearings, only with questions. Questions shaped like silence. The same silence that lives in the sea, that remembers everything. The ocean had become a night without sky. After the discovery of the shattered compass, the Orphean too drifted for hours above a sea that refused to move. The instruments hummed quietly, their screens tracing invisible lines that curved and vanished before reaching completion. Then, at 3:17 Universal Time Coordinated, the sonar registered something vast and vertical rising from the abyss, a structure too symmetrical to be volcanic. The captain dimmed the bridge lights. Outside, the water gleamed faintly, as if reflecting a light that had no source. The crew leaned over the monitors. There it was, a spire, cylindrical, tapering toward a crown. At first, they thought it was a vent column, one of the hydrothermal chimneys of the mid-Atlantic ridge. But its proportions told another story. The sonar revealed a tower over 70 meters high, resting on a circular base. Around it, the seafloor rippled outward in perfect concentric rings. The diver prepared again, though fatigue had begun to feel like a ritual. As he descended, the water grew warmer. A faint thermal bloom near the coordinates, 36 degrees 58 minutes north, 28 degrees 12 minutes west. The NOAA charts listed this area as part of an unclassified magnetic anomaly first logged by the Atlantis II survey in 1981. Few ships returned here. Below 500 meters, light ceased to exist. Only the divers' lamps remained, two soft cones of gold in the endless dark. Then, like a mirage rising through shadow, the tower appeared. A lighthouse, or what remained of one. Its surface was smooth, basalt fused with iron. Enormous plates spiraled upward in helical bands, each marked with sigils, symbols resembling both star maps and wave patterns. The upper portion had crumbled, but within its circular core lay a glass lens, intact, unbroken, impossibly large. It was the lens that emitted the faint glow seen from the surface. But it was not light as we know it. Pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. The diver approached. The hum of his oxygen merged with the ocean's deeper vibration. Tiny creatures drifted past, transparent, luminous, circling the tower like moths around a sleeping flame. He reached the base and saw an inscription half erased by silt. Axis Temporis, the axis of time. The archaeologists on the Orpheon debated later whether the script was Greek or something older. The lettering bore resemblance to archaic Atlantean glyphs found near the Azores Ridge, the same symbols from the Compass Temple. It was as if every ruin pointed to this one, a beacon meant not for sailors but for centuries. Inside, the tower was hollow. The diver entered through a breach in the outer wall. Columns rose like organ pipes, etched with notations resembling astronomical tables. A suspended platform occupied the center, supported by crystal beams that refracted his lamp into 1,000 rainbows. Dust of ages drifted like smoke. On one side hung a metallic pendulum, still swaying imperceptibly, as though time itself refused to stop here. Embedded in the floor beneath it were bronze rings engraved with constellations. Constellations slightly unfamiliar, their alignments warped, perhaps as they appeared before precession changed the sky. The diver's audio feed carried faint whispers of static, voices from the ship above trying to reach him. But every transmission bent and repeated, caught in echo loops, as though the tower itself were folding the signal back upon itself. He moved deeper toward the core. There, within a glass chamber, floated a sphere, the lighthouse lens. It rotated gently, shedding light that wasn't light but vibration. When it turned, the ocean around him shimmered as if thin membranes of time were peeling away. In that glow, he glimpsed images suspended in the current, maps of vanished coastlines, silhouettes of ships sailing upside down, faces carved in coral. The logbook recovered later described the moment as temporal interference. Yet the diver, when he returned, would say quietly, it wasn't interference. It was memory made visible. Geologists speculated that the tower's materials, magnetite mixed with crystalline quartz, could produce piezoelectric effects under tectonic pressure, generating light from stress. But there was no denying the precision of its alignment. The tower's foundation pointed exactly along the magnetic declination shift of the Earth's last pole reversal, some 780,000 years ago. Could it have been built by those who watched such cycles, architects of ages rather than cities? The diver touched the central sphere. For a breathless instant, all instruments froze. The clocks aboard the Orpheon paused, second hands suspended. The sea became utterly still. Then, faintly, the hum returned. One long note, fading like a bell in fog. When he surfaced, dawn had not arrived. The horizon was silver gray, the stars still burning. His compass no longer spun, pointed steadily downward. He looked once more into the sea, where the invisible light still pulsed. The tower waited, motionless, as though marking the rhythm of worlds. Perhaps it had never guided ships. Perhaps it had guided time itself, the pulse that keeps memory from dissolving entirely. And as the Orpheon too drifted eastward, its wake unbroken, the ocean whispered once more. Some lights never die. They simply fall asleep between epochs. The sonar had begun to whisper again. After the discovery of the lighthouse, the Orpheon too drifted east across the mid-Atlantic ridge, tracing a faint echo below, an irregular pattern that pulsed like breath. The instruments mapped a shallow trench veiled by silt, its walls lined with strange rectilinear formations. The currents there moved slower, denser, as if heavy with memory. The diverse descended once more. Their lights touched columns of limestone, delicate and pale, arranged in rows like shelves. Between them were shapes that at first seemed coral growths, but closer inspection revealed order: spirals, slates, thin tablets fossilized in calcium. It was not a city. It was an archive. The team named it the Library of Salt and Bone. Silt drifted like paper ash as the divers hovered between the pillars. The walls were coated in a thin mineral crust, calcite accreted over millennia, preserving the impressions of inscriptions now half erased. Under the light, faint characters shimmered through the salt, arranged in patterns that resembled both language and tide. Marine geologists aboard the Orpheon compared the formation to natural ossuaries found in deep-sea vents, where organic material binds with carbonate to form latticework. Yet the symmetry here defied coincidence. Rows ran parallel. The angles met precisely. The sediment had grown around something designed. At the center of the structure, the divers found a vast hall framed by pillars that curved outward, carved from whale bone fused with coral. Each bore striations resembling tally marks, records, perhaps, or days counted in exile. Near one pillar lay an artifact shaped like an open codex, 2 limestone slabs joined by a mineral hinge. Within, traces of microscopic etching shimmered when struck by light. Later, under electron scanning, the surface would reveal spiraling grooves arranged according to the Fibonacci ratio, patterns echoing those found in nautilus shells and early cuneiform tablets. It was as though knowledge had fossilized itself. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Ilara D'Souza, dictated her notes through the comms line. Possible scriptorium. Organic binding suggests early preservation attempt. Estimated deposit age 11,600 years before present. Depth 1,320 meters. Temperature 2.9 degrees Celsius. Her voice trembled slightly when she added, "These aren't ruins. Their memories turned to bone." As the team advanced, the water thickened with suspended particles. The beams of their lamps diffused into haze. On the floor, they noticed arrangements of vertebrae, whale, dolphin, human-like, placed deliberately in concentric circles. Between them rested clay fragments inscribed with symbols identical to those seen on the compass temple. Somewhere in the dark, a low resonance began. Hydrophones aboard the Orpheon detected it too. A subsonic tone, constant, measured, repeating every 12 seconds. Analysts would later compare it to the bloop recorded by NOAA in 1997, an unexplained ultra-low sound originating from the South Pacific, now thought to be glacial. But this tone was different. Its source was local, harmonic, deliberate. The divers followed the vibration into a narrow passageway, where shelves seemed to converge toward a single chamber. Inside, the walls were smoother, polished to a pearlescent sheen. Rows of what looked like scrolls rested in alcoves, each one sheathed in calcified film. The diver brushed one lightly. It crumbled, releasing a shimmer of fine dust that rose like smoke and dispersed. Beneath it lay a hollow impression, an imprint of writing, faint but legible. The symbols matched early Mycenaean Linear A, yet the layer of sediment predated human writing by thousands of years. Perhaps this was where language itself had first learned to breathe. Dr. D'Souza's voice came through again, soft with awe. "We always thought knowledge began on land. What if it began here, in the sea that forgets nothing?" One diver's camera captured a final image, a great vault ceiling composed of interlocking plates, each carved with reliefs of creatures no longer known. Amphibious, luminous, ascending through spirals of current. Their forms seemed half-human, half-wave. Then, a tremor passed through the trench. Silt lifted, blurring vision. Instruments flickered. The hydrophone tone deepened, stretching into silence. The divers began their ascent. Behind them, the hall dimmed, each tablet fading into the water until only the glow of their lights remained. When they surfaced, dawn was spilling silver across the Atlantic. The Orpheon 2's decks were slick with salt. The team gathered around the data feed. The sonar still displayed the same structure, but where the central chamber had been, there was now only a hollow depression, as if the library had folded itself shut. Later, D'Souza wrote in her log, "Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps it only appears when memory demands it." In the deep, the library sleeps again, its shelves rebuilding, its words dissolving, its bones remembering. And in the quiet between waves, one can almost hear it breathing. By the time the Orpheon 2 left the trench, the sea had grown strangely shallow. The sonar, once mapping dark miles of depth, now showed a plateau rippling with dunes. The scientists called it Sector Thalassa 37. an uncharted shelf stretching between the Azores fracture and the Canary Basin. But to the divers, it felt like a desert folded into the ocean, an expanse of sand that shimmered like powdered glass beneath their lamps.